Section 20 of The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. The Case of Laker Absconded, by Arthur Morrison. Part 1. There were several of the larger London banks and insurance offices from which Hewitt held a sort of general retainer as detective adviser, in fulfillment of which he was regularly consulted as to the measures to be taken in different cases of fraud, forgery, theft, and so forth, which it might be the misfortune of the particular firms to encounter. The more important and intricate of these cases were placed in his hands entirely, with separate commissions in the usual way. One of the most important companies of the sort was the General Guarantee Society, an insurance corporation which, among other risks, took those of the integrity of secretaries, clerks, and cashiers. In the case of a cash box elopement on the part of any person guaranteed by the society, the directors were naturally anxious for a speedy capture of the culprit, and more especially of the booty, before too much of it was spent, in order to lighten the claim upon their funds. And in work of this sort Hewitt was at times engaged, either in general advice and direction, or in the actual pursuit of the plunder and the plunderer. Arriving at his office a little later than usual one morning, Hewitt found an urgent message awaiting him from the General Guarantee Society, requesting his attention to a robbery which had taken place on the previous day. He had gleaned some hint of the case from the morning paper, wherein appeared a short paragraph which ran thus: Serious bank robbery. In the course of yesterday, a clerk employed by Messrs. Little, Neal, and Little, the well-known bankers, disappeared, having in his possession a large sum of money, the property of his employers, a sum reported to be rather over £15,000. It would seem that he had been entrusted to collect the money in his capacity of walk clerk from various other banks and trading concerns during the morning, but failed to return at the usual time. A large number of the notes which he had received had been cashed at the Bank of England before suspicion was aroused. We understand that Detective Inspector Plummer, of Scotland Yard, has the case in hand. The clerk, whose name was Charles William Laker, had, it appeared from the message, been guaranteed in the usual way by the General Guarantee Society, and Hewitt's presence at the office was at once desired in order that steps might quickly be taken for the man's apprehension and in the recovery, at any rate, of as much of the booty as possible. A smart hansom brought Hewitt to Threadneedle Street in a bare quarter of an hour, and there a few minutes' talk with the manager, Mr. Leister, put him in possession of the main facts of the case, which appeared to be simple. Charles William Laker was 25 years of age, and had been in the employ of Messrs. Little, Neal, and Little for something more than 7 years, since he left school, in fact, and until the previous day there had been nothing in his conduct to complain of. His duties as walk clerk consisted in making a certain round, beginning at about 10:30 each morning. There were a certain number of the more important banks between which and Messrs. Little, Neal, and Little there were daily transactions, and a few smaller semi-private banks and merchant firms acting as financial agents with whom there was business intercourse of less importance and regularity, and each of these, as necessary, he visited in turn, collecting cash due on bills and other instruments of a like nature. He carried a wallet, fastened securely to his person by a chain, and this wallet contained the bills and the cash. Usually at the end of his round, when all his bills had been converted into cash, the wallet held very large sums. His work and responsibilities, in fine, were those common to walk clerks in all banks. On the day of the robbery he had started out as usual, possibly a little earlier than was customary, and the bills and other securities in his possession represented considerably more than £15,000. It had been ascertained that he had called in the usual way at each establishment on the round, and had transacted his business at the last place by about 1:15, being then, without doubt, in possession of cash to the full value of the bills negotiated. After that, Mr. Lyster said yesterday's report was that nothing more had been heard of him, but this morning there had been a message to the effect that he had been traced out of the country, to Calais at least, it was thought. The directors of the society wished Hewitt to take the case in hand personally and at once, with a view of recovering what was possible from the plunder by way of salvage, also, of course, of finding Laker, for it is an important moral gain to guarantee societies as an example if a thief is caught and punished. Therefore Hewitt and Mr. Lyster, as soon as might be, made for Messrs. Little, Neal and Little's, that the investigation might be begun. The bank premises were quite near, in Leadenhall Street. Having arrived there, Hewitt and Mr. Lyster made their way to the firm's private rooms. As they were passing an outer waiting room, Hewitt noticed two women. One, the elder, in widow's weeds, was sitting with her head bowed in her hand over a small writing table. Her face was not visible, but her whole attitude was that of a person overcome with unbearable grief, and she sobbed quietly. The other was a young woman of 22 or 23. Her thick black veil revealed no more than that her features were small and regular, and that her face was pale and drawn. She stood with a hand on the elder woman's shoulder, and she quickly turned her head away as the two men entered. Mr. Neal, one of the partners, received them in his own room. "Good morning, Mr. Hewitt," he said, when Mr. Lyster had introduced the detective. "This is a serious business, very. I think I am sorrier for Laker himself than for anybody else, ourselves included. Or, at any rate, I am sorrier for his mother. She is waiting now to see Mr. Little as soon as he arrives. Mr. Little has known the family for a long time. Miss Shaw is with her, too, poor girl. She is a governess or something of that sort, and I believe she and Laker were engaged to be married. It's all very sad." "Inspector Plummer, I understand," Hewitt remarked, "has the affair in hand on behalf of the police." "Yes," Mr. Neal replied. "In fact, he's here now, going through the contents of Laker's desk, and so forth. He thinks it possible Laker may have had accomplices. Will you see him?" "Presently. Inspector Plummer and I are old friends. We met last, I think, in the case of the Stanway cameo, some months ago. But, first, will you tell me how long Laker has been a walk clerk?" "Barely 4 months, although he has been with us altogether 7 years. He was promoted to the walk soon after the beginning of the year. Do you know anything of his habits? What he used to do in his spare time, and so forth?" "Not a great deal. He went in for boating, I believe, though I have heard it whispered that he had 1 or 2 more expensive tastes. Expensive, that is, for a young man in his position," Mr. Neal explained with a dignified wave of the hand that he peculiarly affected. He was a stout old gentleman, and the gesture suited him. "You have had no reason to suspect him of dishonesty before, I take it?" "Oh, no. He made a wrong return once, I believe, that went for some time undetected, but it turned out, after all, to be a clerical error. A mere clerical error." "Do you know anything of his associates out of the office?" "No. How should I? I believe Inspector Plummer has been making inquiries as to that. However, of the other clerks. Here he is, by the by, I expect. Come in." It was Plummer who had knocked, and he came in at Mr. Neal's call. He was a middle sized, small eyed, impenetrable looking man, as yet of no great reputation in the force. Some of my readers may remember his connection with that case, so long a public mystery, that I have elsewhere fully set forth and explained under the title of "The Stanway Cameo Mystery." Plummer carried his billycock hat in one hand and a few papers in the other. He gave Hewitt good morning, placed his hat on a chair, and spread the papers on the table. "There's not a great deal here," he said, "but one thing's plain. Laker had been betting. See here, and here, and here." He took a few letters from the bundle in his hand. "2 letters from a bookmaker about settling. Wonder he trusted a clerk. several telegrams from tipsters, and a letter from some friend, only signed by initials, asking Laker to put a sovereign on a horse for the friend, with his own. I'll keep these, I think. It may be worth while to see that friend if we can find him. Ah, we often find it's betting, don't we, Mr. Hewitt? Meanwhile, there's no news from France yet. Are you sure that is where he has gone? Asked Hewitt. Well, I'll tell you what we've done as yet. First, of course, I went round to all the banks. There was nothing to be got from that. The cashiers all knew him by sight, and one was a personal friend of his. He had called as usual, said nothing in particular, cashed his bills in the ordinary way, and finished up at the Eastern Consolidated Bank at about 1:15. So far there was nothing whatever, but I had started 2 or 3 men meanwhile making inquiries at the railway stations and so on. I had scarcely left the Eastern Consolidated when one of them came after me with news. He had tried Palmer's tourist office, although that seemed an unlikely place, and there struck the track. Had he been there? Not only had he been there, but he had taken a tourist ticket for France. It was quite a smart move in a way. You see, it was the sort of ticket that lets you do pretty well what you like. You have the choice of 2 or 3 different routes to begin with, and you can break your journey where you please, and make all sorts of variations. So that a man with a ticket like that, and a few hours' start, could twist about on some remote branch route and strike off in another direction altogether, with a new ticket from some out-of-the-way place, while we were carefully sorting out and inquiring along the different routes he might have taken. Not half a bad move for a new hand. But he made one bad mistake, as new hands always do. As old hands do, in fact, very often. He was fool enough to give his own name, C. Laker, although that didn't matter much, as the description was enough to fix him. There he was, wallet and all, just as he had come from the Eastern Consolidated Bank. He went straight from there to Palmer's, by the by, and probably in a cab. We judged that by the time. He left the Eastern Consolidated at 1:15, and was at Palmer's by 25 past. 10 minutes. The clerk at Palmer's remembered the time because he was anxious to get out to his lunch, and kept looking at the clock, expecting another clerk in to relieve him. Laker didn't take much in the way of luggage, I fancy. We inquired carefully at the stations, and got the porters to remember the passengers for whom they had been carrying luggage. But none appeared to have had any dealings with our man. That, of course, is as one would expect. He'd take as little as possible with him, and buy what he wanted on the way, or when he'd reached his hiding place. Of course I wired to Calais, it was a Dover to Calais route ticket, and sent a couple of smart men off by the 8:15 mail from Charing Cross. I expect we shall hear from them in the course of the day. I am being kept in London in view of something expected at headquarters, or I should have been off myself. That is all then, up to the present? Have you anything else in view? That's all I've absolutely ascertained at present. As for what I'm going to do, a slight smile curled Plummer's lip. Well, I shall see. I've a thing or two in my mind. Hewitt smiled slightly himself. He recognized Plummer's touch of professional jealousy. Very well, he said, rising. I'll make an inquiry or two for myself at once. Perhaps, Mr. Neal, you'll allow one of your clerks to show me the banks, in their regular order, at which Laker called yesterday. I think I'll begin at the beginning. Mr. Neal offered to place at Hewitt's disposal anything or anybody the bank contained, and the conference broke up. As Hewitt, with the clerk, came through the room separating Mr. Neal's sanctum from the outer office, he fancied he saw the 2 veiled women leaving by a side door. The first bank was quite close to Little, Neal and Little's. There the cashier who had dealt with Laker the day before remembered nothing in particular about the interview. Many other walk clerks had called during the morning, as they did every morning, and the only circumstances of the visit that he could say anything definite about were those recorded in figures in the books. He did not know Laker's name till Plummer had mentioned it, in making inquiries on the previous afternoon. As far as he could remember, Laker behaved much as usual, though really he did not notice much. He looked chiefly at the bills. He described Laker in a way that corresponded with the photograph that Hewitt had borrowed from the bank. A young man with a brown moustache, an ordinary looking, fairly regular face, dressing much as other clerks dressed, tall hat, black cutaway coat, and so on. The numbers of the notes handed over had already been given to Inspector Plummer, and these Hewitt did not trouble about. The next bank was in Cornhill, and here the cashier was a personal friend of Laker's, at any rate an acquaintance, and he remembered a little more. Laker's manner had been quite as usual, he said. Certainly he did not seem preoccupied or excited in his manner. He spoke for a moment or two of being on the river on Sunday, and so on, and left in his usual way. "Can you remember everything he said?" Hewitt asked. "If you can tell me, I should like to know exactly what he did and said to the smallest particular." "Well, he saw me a little distance off, I was behind there at one of the desks, and raised his hand to me, and said, 'How d'ye do?' I came across and took his bills and dealt with them in the usual way. He had a new umbrella lying on the counter, rather a handsome umbrella, and I made a remark about the handle. He took it up to show me, and told me it was a present he had just received from a friend. It was a gorse root handle with 2 silver bands, one with his monogram C.W.L. I said it was a very nice handle, and asked him whether it was fine in his district on Sunday. He said he had been up the river, and it was very fine there, and I think that was all." "Thank you. Now about this umbrella. Did he carry it rolled? Can you describe it in detail?" "Well, I've told you about the handle, and the rest was much as usual, I think. It wasn't rolled, just napping loosely, you know. It was rather an odd shaped handle, though. I'll try and sketch it, if you like, as well as I can remember." He did so, and Hewitt saw in the result rough indications of a gnarled crook, with one silver band near the end, and another with the monogram a few inches down the handle. Hewitt put the sketch in his pocket and bade the cashier good day. At the next bank the story was the same as at the first. There was nothing remembered but the usual routine. Hewitt and the clerk turned down the narrow paved court and through into Lombard Street for the next visit. The bank, that of Buller, Clayton, Lads & Company, was just at the corner at the end of the court, and the imposing stone entrance porch was being made larger and more imposing still, the way being almost blocked by ladders and scaffold poles. Here there was only the usual tale, and so on through the whole walk. The cashiers knew Laker only by sight, and that not always very distinctly. The calls of walk clerks were such matters of routine that little note was taken of the persons of the clerks themselves, who were called by the names of their firms, if they were called by any names at all. Laker had behaved much as usual so far as the cashiers could remember, and when finally the Eastern Consolidated was left behind, nothing more had been learnt than the chat about Laker's new umbrella. Hewitt had taken leave of Mr. Neal's clerk, and was stepping into a hansom, when he noticed a veiled woman in widow's weeds hailing another hansom a little way behind. He recognized the figure again, and said to the driver, "Drive fast to Palmer's tourist office, but keep your eye on that cab behind, and tell me presently if it is following us." The cabman drove off, and after passing one or two turnings, opened the lid above Hewitt's head and said, "That there other cab is a follerin' us, sir, and keepin' about even distance all along." "All right, that's what I wanted to know. Palmer's now." At Palmer's the clerk who had attended to Laker remembered him very well, and described him. He also remembered the wallet, and thought he remembered the umbrella, was practically sure of it, in fact, upon reflection. He had no record of the name given, but remembered it distinctly to be Laker. As a matter of fact, names were never asked in such a transaction, but in this case Laker appeared to be ignorant of the usual procedure, as well as in a great hurry, and asked for the ticket, and gave his name all in one breath, probably assuming that the name would be required. Hewitt got back to his cab and started for Charing Cross. The cabman once more lifted the lid and informed him that the hansom with the veiled woman in it was again following, having waited while Hewitt had visited Palmer's. At Charing Cross, Hewitt discharged his cab and walked straight to the Lost Property Office. The man in charge knew him very well, for his business had carried him there frequently before. "I fancy an umbrella was lost in the station yesterday," Hewitt said. "It was a new umbrella, silk, with a gnarled gorse root handle and 2 silver bands, something like this sketch." There was a monogram on the lower band. CWL were the letters. "Has it been brought here?" "There was 2 or 3 yesterday," the man said. "Let's see." He took the sketch and retired to a corner of his room. "Oh, yes, here it is, I think. Isn't this it? Do you claim it?" "Well, not exactly that, but I think I'll take a look at it, if you'll let me. By the way, I see it's rolled up. Was it found like that?" "No, the chap rolled it up what found it. Porter, he was. It's a fad of his, rolling up umbrellas close and neat, and he's rather proud of it. He often looks as though he'd like to take a man's umbrella away and roll it up for him, when it's a bit clumsy done. Rum fad, eh?" "Yes, everybody has his little fad, though. Where was this found? Close by here?" "Yes, sir, just there, almost opposite this window, in the little corner." "About 2 o'clock?" About that time, more or less." Hewitt took the umbrella up, unfastened the band, and shook the silk out loose. Then he opened it, and as he did so a small scrap of paper fell from inside it. Hewitt pounced on it like lightning. Then, after examining the umbrella thoroughly, inside and out, he handed it back to the man who had not observed the incident of the scrap of paper. "That will do, thanks," he said. "I only wanted to take a peep at it. Just a small matter connected with a little case of mine. Good morning." He turned suddenly and saw, gazing at him with a terrified expression from a door behind, the face of the woman who had followed him in the cab. The veil was lifted, and he caught but a mere glance of the face ere it was suddenly withdrawn. He stood for a moment to allow the woman time to retreat, and then left the station and walked toward his office close by. Scarcely 30 yards along the Strand he met Plummer. "I'm going to make some much closer inquiries all down the line as far as Dover," Plummer said. "They wire from Calais that they have no clue as yet, and I mean to make quite sure, if I can, that Laker hasn't quietly slipped off the line somewhere between here and Dover. There's one very peculiar thing," Plummer added confidentially. "Did you see the 2 women who were waiting to see a member of the firm at Little, Neal and Little's?" "Yes, Laker's mother and his fiancée, I was told." "That's right. Well, do you know that girl, Shaw her name is, has been shadowing me ever since I left the bank? Of course I spotted it from the beginning. These amateurs don't know how to follow anybody, and as a matter of fact, she's just inside that jeweler's shop door behind me now, pretending to look at the things in the window. But it's odd, isn't it?" "Well," Hewitt replied, "of course it's not a thing to be neglected. If you'll look very carefully at the corner of Villiers Street, without appearing to stare, I think you will possibly observe some signs of Laker's mother. She's shadowing me." Plummer looked casually in the direction indicated, and then immediately turned his eyes in another direction. "I see her," he said. "She's just taking a look round the corner. That's a thing not to be ignored. Of course the Lakers' house is being watched. We set a man on it at once yesterday. But I'll put some one on now to watch Miss Shaw's place, too. I'll telephone through to Little's. Probably they'll be able to say where it is. And the women themselves must be watched, too. As a matter of fact, I had a notion that Laker wasn't alone in it, and it's just possible, you know, that he has sent an accomplice off with his tourist ticket to lead us a dance while he looks after himself in another direction. Have you done anything?" "Well," Hewitt replied, with a faint reproduction of the secretive smile with which Plummer had met an inquiry of his earlier in the morning, "I've been to the station here, and I've found Laker's umbrella in the Lost Property Office." "Oh, then probably he has gone. I'll bear that in mind. and perhaps have a word with the lost property man. Plummer made for the station and Hewitt for his office. He mounted the stairs and reached his door just as I myself, who had been disappointed in not finding him in, was leaving. I had called with the idea of taking Hewitt to lunch with me at my club, but he declined lunch. "I have an important case in hand," he said. "Look here, Brett. See this scrap of paper? You know the types of the different newspapers. Which is this?" He handed me a small piece of paper. It was part of a cutting containing an advertisement which had been torn in half. "OAST. You first, then to 3rd L, number 197, Red BL, straight time." "I think," I said, "this is from the Daily Chronicle. Judging by the paper, it is plainly from the agony column, but all the papers use pretty much the same type for these advertisements, except the Times. If it were not torn I could tell you at once, because the Chronicle columns are rather narrow." "Never mind, I'll send for them all." He rang and sent Carrot for a copy of each morning paper of the previous day. Then he took from a large wardrobe cupboard a decent but well worn and rather roughened tall hat. Also a coat a little worn and shiny on the collar. He exchanged these for his own hat and coat, and then substituted an old necktie for his own clean white one, and encased his legs in mud-spotted leggings. This done, he produced a very large and thick pocketbook, fastened by a broad elastic band, and said, "Well, what do you think of this? Will it do for Queen's taxes, or sanitary inspection, or the gas or the water supply?" "Very well indeed, I should say," I replied. "What's the case?" "Oh, I'll tell you all about that when it's over. No time now. Oh, here you are, Carrot. By the by, Carrot, I'm going out presently by the back way. Wait for about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour after I'm gone, and then just go across the road and speak to that lady in black with the veil, who is waiting in that little foot passage opposite. Say Mr. Martin Hewitt sends his compliments, and he advises her not to wait, as he has already left his office by another door and has been gone some little time. That's all. It would be a pity to keep the poor woman waiting all day for nothing. Now the papers. Daily News, Standard, Telegraph, Chronicle. Yes, here it is, in the Chronicle." The whole advertisement read thus: "Y.O.B. H.R. Shop roast. You first, then tonight. O2, second top 3rd L, number 197, Red BL, straight mon, one at a time." "What's this?" I asked. "A cryptogram?" "I'll see," Hewitt answered, "but I won't tell you anything about it till afterwards. So you get your lunch. Carrot, bring the directory." This was all I actually saw of this case myself, and I have written the rest in its proper order from Hewitt's information, as I have written some other cases entirely. End of Part 1. The Case of Laker Absconded by Arthur Morrison.